My name is Nolan McCarty. I'm the acting dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, so I'm very delighted to invite you to the Woodrow Wilson School, welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson School this morning, and to the conference, Students in the Electronic Media, Teaching in the Technological Age. Developments in the electronic media have had profound impacts throughout all aspects of society, and of course its effects on children and education are especially important. Electronic media has become an integral part of children's lives and a major point of interest for parents and for teachers and school administrators. As with so many developments, the emergence of these new forms of media creates significant opportunities as well as challenges. Questions about the impact of electronic media on children's well-being have led parents and teachers to ask how and why children should be using technology. Today's conference will showcase innovative uses of technology in the classroom and provide school districts with ways they can enhance their classroom curriculums and professional development programs. There'll be an overview of research regarding electronic media and its effects on the achievement and social development of children. In addition to panel discussions, Nancy Willard will provide a keynote address on how teachers, like parents, can help their students become cyber savvy. This conference today is being held in conjunction with the latest journal of the future of children entitled Children in Electronic Media. This issue, released in April of 2008, shines a spotlight on electronic media, focusing mainly on childhood well-being and its policy implications. I'd also like to thank the three co-sponsors of today's event. First, the Teacher Preparatory Program at Princeton University, a program which helps train Princeton students for teaching credentials and also provides professional development to the broader educational community. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Education Research Section, an interdisciplinary unit within the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton as well as in the Industrial Research Section. And the ERS promotes research and educational decision-making and policy. And finally, I'd like to thank the journal, The Future of Children, which is a cooperative effort between the Woodrow Wilson School and the Brookings Institution, published by our Center for Research on Children. The journal seeks to promote effective policies and policymaking by providing policymakers the up-to-date information on children's welfare issues. With that, I'll turn it over to your first panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Webb, and I'm the director of the program in teacher preparation here at Princeton. Is it on? I think so, okay. Shall I start over? I'm John Webb, and I'm the director of the program in teacher preparation here at Princeton University. And our office is delighted to be one of the co-sponsors of today's conference, along with the Education Research Section and the incomparable Lisa Markman, who does so much hard work to make each year's Future Children Conference so richly informative. And it is both a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to moderate this panel and to introduce this morning's panelists, who are going to be considering the question, what does research have to say? When you read Jean Brooks Gunn's and Elisabeth Donahue's introductory chapter to the publication that's associated with today's conference, there's a sentence that sort of jumps off the page. It reads, "America's young people spend more time using media than they do engaging in any single activity other than sleeping. It should come as no surprise to parents and teachers when we think about what we see young people doing these days. And yet, this quote reminds us starkly of the extent to which media do indeed dominate the lives of young people. As educators, we know the extent to which we can rely on media to enhance instruction and learning in ways that were unimagined even 10 years ago. And in teacher preparation, we are ever mindful of the need to include the training of our teacher candidates in the effective use of media as integral parts of our programs. We live in a fascinating age where media enable us to open up worlds of learning opportunities for young people, and yet, on the other hand, Trekkie Monster, in that brilliant little Broadway musical, Avenue Q, reminds us of another reality in his song, "The Internet is for Porn." I'm going to introduce the panelists who will explore with us what the research tells us about media and children, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. Not listed on the program is our first presenter, who is standing in for Jean Brooks Gunn, who is unable to be with us, and that is Elisabeth Donahue. Elisabeth is a lecturer of Public and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She is associate editor of The Future of Children. She is a lawyer with both federal and state public policy and advocacy experience, and is a member of the bar in both the District of Columbia and Massachusetts. Prior to coming to Princeton, she worked for the National Women's Law Center in Washington, D.C. She earned a J.D. from the Georgetown University Law Center. Our second speaker will be John Black. He is the Cleveland E. Dodge Professor of Telecommunications and Education at Teachers College at Columbia University, where he is a member of both the Department of Human Development and the Department of Math, Science, and Technology. And he serves as co-director of the Institute for Learning Technologies. He has a bachelor's degree in math from MIT and a PhD in cognitive psychology from Stanford. He was an assistant and then associate professor of psychology and computer science at Yale before joining the Teachers College faculty. He has served as a consultant to the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, IBM Research, and Bell Laboratories. He is the author of over 80 refereed publications and 4 books. His research focuses on cognitive research and its application to the design and use of educational technology. The third speaker will be Craig A. Anderson. He is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychology at Iowa State University. He received his bachelor's in psychology and sociology from Butler University and his master's and PhD in psychology from Stanford University. He was an assistant and associate professor at Rice University and a visiting professor at The Ohio State University before joining the faculty of the University of Missouri-Columbia, where he became full professor and has served as director of graduate studies for the Department of Psychology and director of graduate admissions. He joined the Iowa State University faculty in 1999 as professor and chair of the Department of Psychology. In 2004, Professor Anderson was presented with the Iowa State University Foundation Award for Outstanding Achievement in Research, and in 2005 he was awarded the title Distinguished Professor, the highest honor given by Iowa State. He was a founding member of the Society of Southwestern Social Psychologists and served as its president. He has also played an important role in the founding of social psychologists in Texas and social psychologists around the Midwest. He is currently on the Executive Council of the International Society for Research on Aggression. And finally, Kathryn Montgomery, who is professor in the School of Communication at American University, where she is a professor in the Public Communication Division. She comes to American University with more than 25 years of experience in both the nonprofit field and academe. For 12 years, she was president of the Washington, D.C.-based Center for Media Education, which she co-founded in 1991. During her tenure at the Center for Media Education, her research, publications, and testimony helped frame the national public policy debate on a range of critical media issues. She led a coalition of child advocacy, health, and education groups in a series of successful advocacy campaigns, leaving behind a legacy of policies on behalf of children and families. They include a Federal Communications Commission rule requiring a minimum of 3 hours per week of educational, informational television programming for children, a content-based rating system for TV programs, and the first federal legislation to protect children's privacy on the Internet. It really is a tremendously distinguished group of researchers and workers in media who will be speaking with us this morning about what research has to say. And I will turn it now over to Elisabeth.
Hi, thank you for coming today. This is a terrific conference, and I also thank Lisa, who puts these together for the future of children every year. And the amount of work that goes into it is incredible. So thank you, Lisa. In addition to my role as one of the co-editors on this volume, I'm also the associate editor of The Future of Children, so I wanted to take a little bit of time just to tell you about who we are, for those of you who don't know us. We produce 2 volumes a year. We have outreach events like this and throughout the country and in D.C. We have policy briefs and shorter products that we post on a website, and we cover a gamut of issues. We've done things on excellence in the classroom, which you all might be interested in. We've done things on childhood obesity, marriage, and child well-being. I mean, it really is a very broad range of child policy issues that we look at. And so I wanted to sort of explain how we came up with the idea to do children in electronic media, which truthfully doesn't really fall under the expertise of any of our senior editors. We tend to look at income issues and health issues and whatnot. But we were sitting around one day talking about, well, we need a volume that really is tapping into what parents and teachers are worried about. And what are they worried about? And anyone who's spent any amount of time with any parents, and I spend a lot of time with other parents because I have 3 kids, knows that media, and electronic media in particular, is what everybody is talking about and worried about. And I sort of had this thought, like, is it a problem? Or is it just today's Beatles? Is it just that we don't get it and the kids do? And is it really terrific, like the Beatles were, as we soon discovered? And so we set out to do this volume to find out what we could about children in electronic media. The Future of Children volumes, the premise of them is that these are review articles. So the idea is if you pick up one of our volumes, you should get all the information that is around on a particular topic. We have very esteemed authors, one of whom is here today, who wade through all the research of a particular area, pull out what they think is important for you to know, and really break it down into readable text. And so I'm very happy that this volume came out because I do think it is an issue that has a huge amount of resonance for parents and teachers alike. So what did we learn? I'm not going to go through all the facts because we'll all fall asleep and we haven't had enough coffee and it was too weak anyway. But if you go through the volume, there's a lot of data, particularly in the first chapter by Roberts. There's some tables in there if you're interested. And also, if you go to our website, we will be putting shorter products on the site in the next few months, and we'll also be having some fact sheets there that break media use trends down by state. So if you're interested in how your state is doing, that would be an interesting place to go in the next few months. But just some overview themes that came out of the volume. One is, and again, no surprise to anyone in here, kids are using electronic media all day, every day. And it's looking at like 8 to 18-year-olds are using media 6+ hours a day. So as John said, it's the single most activity that they engage in other than sleeping, which is an astounding quote, and we use it a lot. Media, it's not surprising that they use this because media saturated the home. One of the facts is that a typical 8 to 18-year-old lives in a house with 3 televisions, 3 video players, 3 radios, 3 iPods or other MP3 players, 2 video game consoles, and a personal computer. And while we may think that all these other media have taken the place of television, that's not true. Kids still watch just as much television. It's that they've layered on all these other types of media in addition to the television watching. So television watching, if you look at the trends, they're pretty static over the last 40 years. But media use has gone up because they're just layering it with these other media platforms. One of the reasons they can do this is that multitasking is at an all-time high. And you all know this, right? You see your students doing 17 things at once. And in the home, it's even more pervasive. 81% of the kids report that when they're using media, they're multitasking. They're using more than one media at a time. So this is a lot of media going on. It also makes measuring how much the kids are using difficult, because the typical time use diary doesn't really work. If a kid's on a computer and IMing and writing a school report and listening to music and flipping back and forth between some, clothing ad that they want to check out, how one measures that is actually very difficult. And it's a huge challenge for researchers right now. The other thing that's going on that's important, particularly for teenagers, is that there's this concept of convergence, right? You can get the same media program on multiple platforms. So you can watch television on your cell phone, and you can listen to the radio on your iPod, but you can also watch TV on your iPod. And all these things are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so they're portable. And so kids have an incredible ability to use these media outside the presence of teachers and parents and outside their home. So if we think that we're going to stand over our kids and regulate everything that they do, we're not. And that's the reality. Okay, so we know that kids are using a lot of media. So what? Do we care? Is it having any harmful effects on them? What we found, and as I said, we had a similar panel last night, I feel like we need buttons. The overall conclusion is so simplistic as to be almost laughable, which is that it's the content. Content matters. More than the type of platform the kids are using, more than how much time they spend using these media. What matters is what they're engaging in. And so I keep imagining we'll have like, it's the content stupid, pins made. The reason that this is so interesting, A, it tells us something, but B, regulating content is the hardest thing you can do. At the household level and the parental level, you can regulate how much time your kids use. And I always like to tell the story about when I was working on the introduction. It was over Christmas break, and I just kept saying to my kids, okay, go play video games, and you have an hour. And I had no idea what they were playing. So I kept thinking, well, but I'll write that it's really the content, not how much time they do it. It's very hard with all the media that comes into households to see what kids are actually playing. When you're looking at video games, you don't know what's on stage 3 of the video game, and unless people want to sit and play video games with their kids all day, they're probably not going to know. We can turn it off, as many schools have done, but I'm not sure that's the answer either. So regulating content is very difficult. At the parental household level, we are basically beholden to rating systems, which are not done by an independent government entity. They're usually done by the commercial industries that are producing the type of media the kids are engaged in. So whether the rating, and they're very confusing. There's a different rating system for every type of media out there. So most parents don't know what the ratings mean. They don't know what the content is of the ratings. And so I'm not sure rating systems are a very satisfactory way for parents to evaluate what the content is. One of the interesting things we found, and I think this is important, I don't know that we found it, but at the government level, just a quick, is that, usually we look to the government to help us, right, when we have a policy issue. And we have a First Amendment in this country. So if we discover that content is the issue, we have to grapple with the First Amendment. There's been countless pieces of legislation that have come out of Congress that have tried to protect children from harmful and offensive material on the internet, and they've all been struck down on First Amendment grounds. And we have a Supreme Court case that's a Supreme Court today that's quite protective of commercial speech. So the First Amendment is an issue we have to grapple with in the policy world. That said, one of the things we found that was hopeful in this volume is that media, by and large, can have positive effects for kids. It's not all terrible. It depends on the content. Again, chapter after chapter, that's what we come up with. But there are amazing ways that media are being used today to really teach children and youth very positive things. So starting with educational television for the younger children and getting into some of this social marketing that's been used for teens and whatnot is actually a very exciting place that media is being used in a beneficial way to get kids to know about HIV, about why delaying sex is a good thing, why not to drink too much, why not to smoke. And in our policy brief that we handed out, you'll see some examples of some of these social marketing campaigns that have been so exciting and using new media in a way that I didn't even know you could, and really relies on mostly the teens to generate their own content and have them own these very positive health messages. And it's something that I think will come up in this conversation today because it's something schools could be looking at doing as well. And I think the nonprofit world has actually done a pretty good job in this area. One of the things we found in terms of schools was very interesting to me, and we'll talk a lot about this today, is that while we know that media can have beneficial effects for when personal use of media can have beneficial effects, this doesn't necessarily translate to schools. The findings for the benefits of media technology used in schools were much less conclusive. And it's because there were sort of these caveats. One was it really depends on the comfort level of the teacher. And not all teachers have the same comfort level of media use as the kids do. So a kid can go onto the internet, do all this user-generated stuff for the campaign to prevent teen pregnancy, and it's fun and exciting. The teachers don't necessarily have that comfort level. I mean, I don't have that comfort level, right? I don't need, in editing this volume, there were terms that I had to look up in the dictionary. Well, they weren't in the dictionary. I had to look up on the internet. So that is an important piece to whether this can be effective in the schools. The other thing is that it has to be integrated into the curriculum. We can't let technology drive the curriculum. It really needs to go the other way. Curriculum has to drive the technology, and we're going to hear a lot about that today. And finally, and this is always the plea we all make, right, is that it's the resources. You can't sort of do this part way. I was interviewing a school teacher in Massachusetts, and they have these fabulous websites. Many of you probably use them, United Streaming, whatnot, that they were using in their science program. But none of the kids could access it because the technology for these websites were so, advanced that the computers that they had couldn't, go fast enough to access these technologies. So resources are important. If you're going to do it, you really got to put your money into it and do it right. And these are not inexpensive items, as you all know. I'm looking at all the laptops around here. So anyway, I just want to finish there and just say I'm thrilled that you're all here. I'm thrilled that we have these speakers who are going to take these topics that I just talked about and elaborate on them. And I thank you.
Well, my PowerPoints come up here. I'll have to apologize. I wasn't one of the authors in this volume. I guess there is one on media learning, a chapter in there. And I guess they couldn't get those people, so you got me instead. So, but there's that chapter. Actually, there are a couple of them. Focuses mostly on preschool kids and television. Whereas and one of the things it says is there's very little research on video games. But I've done some, and I'm going to tell you about it. It's very recent, and some of the studies that we've done showing how these things can be used effectively. So my focus not going to be so much on the dangers as it is on how to effectively use these things. First, I want to tell you about a study we did with a couple of fairly popular computer-based games and simulations, Civilization and SimCity. There's a lot of hype around about that in the popular press and books and whatever, that video games are terrific learning environments, and there's almost no evidence, in fact, that this is the case. So we wanted to find out. And so we took, one of the problems with studying video games, and one of the problems with using them in schools, is they waste a lot of time. They're designed to do this, If you go out and you spend $60 on a game, then you want to spend a lot of time playing that game. On the other hand, so wasting time in a sense is the name of the game there. If you're going to place it within the school, you want to be able to get to things pretty quickly. And there are now some games coming out that are designed more to do that by companies like Fuzzy Lane, although kids tell me that those games are boring. But Civilization, on the other hand, SimCity, the two that we chose them because they were popular and they're widely available and bestsellers, and they also have academic content that we can look at. So we were, in terms of learning, we were interested in not just learning to play the game, but learning academic content while doing that. Okay, so this is what Civilization looks like. You have this sort of God's eye view of this landscape here. And you sort of build your own civilization there, and then you set it running, and the simulation shows the way you design your civilization, how it works out. So you can change things from history, but produce alternative histories to the real history, and see how things change. So for instance, you could change something like, suppose the Western Hemisphere had horses when the Europeans arrived, and that was a big advantage when the Europeans came in when they had conflict with the Native Americans, and then you can sort of see how history would play out if that change had happened. SimCity is somewhat similar, a little bit older game, where you design a city in a certain way, has certain things laid out in certain ways, certain zoning policies, certain tax policies, and so forth, and see how your city grows. Okay. So again, in studying one of these things, one of the problems is it takes a long time to become an expert. We want to look at people who are experts in these things and what they knew and had learned as a product of that. So there are all sorts of online discussion boards about these things. And we were looking at, I should say here, I'm going to talk about middle school students and high school students. This is a high school student study. And we recruited people off of these online discussion boards. We had a series of questions to determine just how expert they were in this, so we chose experts. And it's not getting. And so anyhow, so we came up with the experts in Civilization who were not expert in SimCity, and experts in SimCity who were not experts in Civilization. So they were all expert game players of some sort, and there were almost no people who were expert in both because life is too short for that. But so we could use the other group as a control to compare experts and non-experts. And one of the interesting things is that emerged out of this, out of the 179 people we recruited to participate in this online, these were all volunteers, only 9 were girls. So the TV networks and the marketers are wondering what happened to the teenage boys. Well, we found them. And so that was a little unfortunate in terms of our design. If we had The Sims, that's another popular computer game, then you would have had at least half of them would have been girls in there. But that's a game actually that doesn't have easily identifiable academic content. So they participated in this thing online, and like I say, we could compare the experts and novices across the two. And so we gave them what we call a pre-test, because that was a test on academic content, say, about history that was in the game itself. Okay, did they learn this stuff? And then we looked at another concept, preparation for future learning. And that is that they read a college textbook chapter related to this. The history one was on the growth of empires. So this was not content that was explicitly in the game. It was related to the game content and took you further. It was like future learning, but also learning of a formal sort. You're reading a college textbook chapter. In fact, we took these textbook chapters from courses at Columbia University, even though these were high school students. Okay, so then we had a post-test, which looked at the academic contact from reading this textbook chapter as a function of whether they were expert or not in Civilization. And we looked at different kinds of knowledge in different forms. Propositions, these are networks of facts. Procedures, these are under what conditions do you perform what actions. Images, which are not just pictures, but also interpreted pictures. And systems, this is like knowing if you change one thing, what other things change, like the horse introduction example I gave earlier. Okay. So surprisingly, perhaps, the game experts in Civilization showed no more knowledge of history that was in the game than did the non-experts. So they did not seem to learn directly information about history that was in the game. Okay. On the other hand, when we looked at them reading this textbook chapter after they had played the game or whatever, there was a big difference there on all four of those knowledge types that I showed you, both facts and procedures and systems and images. So it seemed that playing these games, and I think this is generally true, provide an experiential base, a set of experiences with historical things that then served as a good basis for more formal academic learning that would follow on to that. Okay, so what I'm recommending as a role for these things is that they be played before they're covered in school, and then you would learn more from the school coverage. A good way of doing this, for instance, might be to recommend students play Civilization over the summer when they're going to get world history the next year. Okay, and they probably would have a set of experiences from doing that would make them more interested in history and also better able to learn from this formal academic experience. A related kind of thing, another study is this was with a business simulation, again with high school students, and this actually came from Harvard Business School. It was on entrepreneurship and is used in business colleges, undergraduates. And so you learn to start companies and whatever. You play through this game many times, starting many different companies. And we found that from just playing the game, they didn't actually learn all that much. Okay. On the other hand, if they played the game and they were asked questions to reflect on the strategies that they use and how those strategies related to their background reading in the content related to the game. Okay, not directly in the game, but related to it. So this is kind of a similar sort of point. In fact, just asking them reflective questions about their strategies didn't do much. But relating it to the background readings, that was where the magic occurred. Okay, I should say, actually, I've also done TV research in the past. An interesting one was interesting show a number of years ago called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. George Lucas did this, put it on network TV. It probably only lasted as long as it did because of his influence. But this was back when Indiana Jones was popular before. It looks like they're about to bring him back now again in the movies. And so this was Indy as like an 18-year-old wandering around Europe and Africa during the time of World War I and running into various historical figures and events. And Lucas's hope was that by doing that, the kids would, one, learn more, learn about these historical figures and events. And I should say that the sort of encounter with these were fairly brief in the show itself, and that they would also increase the interest. So we went over a couple of middle schools in East Harlem, New York, and wanted to find out if that was in fact working for those kids. And these are typically underperforming kinds of students. And one, we found out that none of them had ever seen the show. Okay, so that was one problem. So we actually showed it to them, had them watch an episode. We thought they would, this is much better than what more interesting than what they usually did in school. So we thought they would be interested in it, but they weren't. And what we found, in fact, was that just watching the show, they basically learned almost nothing about those historical events and characters. And in fact, if anything, their interest in learning more went down a little bit, having watched the show. They figured they knew more than enough at that point, I think. So without some sort of discussion and coverage and pointing out that here was this person that was in there, and here's more information about them, you didn't learn anything from the media like that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what middle school students and some little computer simulation games that we created on our own. You can create little small simulations like this fairly easily to drive home certain topics. These were middle school students that focused on physical science. Particularly, the example I want to show you here is a roller coaster simulation talking about energy and kinetic and potential energy and how they flow back. It flows back and forth between those two forms. And we looked at different ways for students to learn about this. One, just reading a text. One of the texts with diagrams, which were in fact screenshots from the program itself. Using the program to play as an animated movie illustrating these things. Having as a slideshow where you sort of showed key points. And then there's a condition we call direct manipulation animation. Here's an example of one of these. So this is the roller coaster. and it sort of goes back and forth across this thing and sort of up and down. And you can see the bar graphs at the top there change as the roller coaster goes up and down. As the kinetic and potential energy flows back and forth, and total energy can change too. Down at the bottom, you'll see there's a slider which you can click on with your mouse and move back and forth in one condition. So if you're playing this as an animated movie, you just see the roller coaster going and the bar graphs changing. The direct animation case is where you put the pointer on that slider, move your mouse to move it. So you're manipulating that variable, namely how high it is above the ground, how high it is in the gravity well, by movement. Okay? Then you're seeing the changes in the value of the energy, the two different kinds of energy that happens immediately as a focus of that, as a function of that. So that's the direct manipulation animation. Okay. And in fact, we showed that this direct manipulation animation, where you're actively manipulating this thing and seeing an animated result, was particularly good at learning these things, much better than the other conditions. And particularly, it was the more complicated the system, or the less capable the student, the more this was an essential way to be learning this stuff. If you had good students in a simple system, they could do it just by reading text or text plus diagrams. But as it became a more complicated system, and or less capable students, then they needed this simulation of this sort to do it. And this is an example of a new topic that's come up recently in cognitive psychology called embodied cognition. And this is really understanding something fully. It involves building a perceptual simulation of it in your head to go along with the more abstract symbolic tasks. And one of the ways this has come about is that when they looked at neuroimaging studies, where you look at what areas of the brain become active when people are reasoning about something, many tasks we originally thought were purely abstract and symbolic. If the students really understood it, the perceptual areas of the brain light up too. So having this kind of direct perceptual experience with it, movement, so we're thinking this is a small version of this. The movement as a way of manipulating one variable's value is crucial here, and also being able to visualize and kind of mentally animate using the visual parts of the brain, in addition to symbolic and knowing the relationship between these two different variables. You need all those things to fully understand something, to have a feel for it, in addition to know it. And interesting now, we're getting a new generation of simulations and games where this full perceptual experience in building these perceptual simulations and embodied cognition is more easily to do. So in fact, the most popular games these days are ones that involve physical movement a lot. Kids are no longer sitting there just looking at the screen, but the Wii has become the most popular video game system. You get up and you hold these two things and you sort of move around to interact with it. You're not sitting there twiddling your thumbs with the controllers. Guitar Hero is another one. The controller for that is you're playing this guitar. You're not doing stuff on the screen there. And sort of augmented reality is the new nature of these things, where you might think of the others as being virtual reality, like Civilization. You have this virtual world that you're manipulating on the screen. In this case, the technology and the computers are integrated in together with real reality, and it's a combination of you moving around and doing stuff in the real world and the simulated world within the system. And this stuff seems readily adaptable to provide this fully embodied experience that gives kids a feel for what they're learning, in addition to knowing it more abstractly and symbolically. But you need both those things to have a deeper understanding and a full understanding of what you're learning. Let's see. Okay, so that's pretty much what I just said. I should say, actually, you're going to hear a presentation in the next session by Dan McVeigh that presents another take on how to integrate this direct experience with a more symbolic perspective on it. That's all I have to say.
All right. It's very seldom I actually do presentations where you have to switch computers where the technology actually works. So. Sure. Whoop, whoop, whoop. All right. Let me start off with the what I think of as the Calvin and Hobbes take on media violence.
I read another article whining about how much violence is on TV. So I've seen a few thousand homicides in my day. What's the big deal?
Don't you worry that all this violence is desensitizing?
Nah, I'd like to shoot the idiots who think this stuff affects me.
Now, I should point out, as a person who does a fair amount of research on violent media effects, I actually get emails like this. I'm 14 years old. I've played violent video games all my life, and I haven't killed anybody yet. If you don't stop what you're doing, I'm going to kick your ass. I actually get emails like that from people, at least who claim that they're 14 years old. They usually have no punctuation, filled with misspellings, and sometimes it's just absolutely indecipherable. I would like to sort of echo the statement that others have already mentioned a couple of times, and that is repeated throughout the Future of Children, that volume, which, by the way, I think is an excellent volume, even if you take out the chapter that I have something to do with. Or perhaps especially if you take out the one that, depending on how you want to look at it. But basically, I believe that video games, that a well-designed video game is an excellent teaching tool. There are a lot of characteristics to it that map onto what we know about teaching and learning. And again, I'd like to echo this idea that what they teach depends on the content. This is a message I've been trying to get out for quite some time, and a message that media violence researchers have been trying to get out for over 50 years now, and that the general public still doesn't seem to get, that content matters. There are also a lot of good nonviolent games out there, games that are exciting, that are fun, age-appropriate. I mean, my kids grew up with video games. They did not grow up with violent games, but again, there's probably 100 video games stashed around my house somewhere, even though both of my kids are now, well, one's long gone and the other one is graduating from high school in a couple of weeks. A lot of these games are educational, some are primarily entertainment, some teach standard school content. There is research on some of these games. There's not nearly as much research as what one might think, which John alluded to earlier, that there's not a whole lot out there, but there is some. There's also some specific games that have been created to deal with very specific issues. So, for example, there are some games that have been created to help teach kids how to manage problems like diabetes, asthma. There's one that has a little bit of research on it, helping kids manage ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And of course, flying simulators have been around forever, and we know that they work, that you can teach people how to fly without actually having to first put them in a plane. That's a good thing. You'd lose a lot of pilots otherwise, and a lot of planes. I might point out just, my son, when he was very young, we bought a game for him called Flight Unlimited, which taught you basically how to fly. It was a $35 game. You had 3 different planes. None of them were military planes. There was a stunt plane and a Cessna and whatnot. And sometime after he played this for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months or so, he and a bunch of his classmates actually went off to one of these NASA space camps for kids, where they go and learn how to be an astronaut. And one of the things that they were doing at that time was sort of towards the end of this 2-week summer camp kind of thing, this space camp thing, they would each be assigned a mission on a space shuttle. And each member of a team, they would break up into like 5 or 6 person teams, would have a specific mission. my son's, or a specific task. My son was assigned to be the pilot, and he actually, using the same simulator that the NASA astronauts train on, he successfully landed the space shuttle on his first try, which they said hadn't happened before. They did also point out he damaged the landing gear, but they said they wouldn't charge him for that. But now I like to think that, you know, it was a combination of great genetics and great parenting that led to this success, but I think it was the $35 Flight Unlimited program played on an old Mac LC3, for those of you who are old enough to remember that computer. What really matters, though, in terms of what game effects are, or any kind of media effects, are two things. One is the amount of time. So it isn't just content, but the other is content. Content is probably more important than time. We just talk just real quickly about, you know, when we think about problems or risky behaviors, which is really what I want to talk about today. Very often, at least in the popular press, newspapers and magazines, TV, you know, news shows, whatever, they're always looking for the cause. What is the cause of childhood obesity? What is the cause of early onset of drinking or sexual activity or smoking or whatever? What is the cause? And it's never the cause. Right? There are a number of risk factors that contribute to almost any risk behavior that you can think of. And usually, again, we can think of risk factors. These are factors that increase the likelihood that some sort of a bad outcome will happen, whether that be early onset sexual behavior or early onset smoking behavior, whatever you want to look at. Risk factors can range from, you know, genetic, environmental, I mean, all sorts of different things. One of the things that people frequently don't seem to get, and it took me a long time, a number of years before this finally sunk in, a lot of people don't seem to understand that in the modern scientific world, in the medical world, in the psychological world, causality is probabilistic. It's not the old necessary and sufficient kind of causality that you know, that's typically taught in the first logic course that one has. And just to give you an example in terms of smoke, I mean, we all sort of now, as a society, agree that smoking causes lung cancer. But yet we also know that not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer, and we know that some people who don't smoke do get lung cancer. This all violates the old sort of necessary and sufficient rules. What this means in some sense is that when we say smoking causes cancer, what we're really saying is smoking is a risk factor that causes an increase in the likelihood that one will get cancer. From a risk factor approach, another point that I think is important to keep in mind is that risk factors accumulate. A person who has 4 risk factors for a particular risky behavior or bad outcome is more likely to have that outcome occur than someone who has only 1 risk factor. Okay? And so, you know, when I talk about electronic media being a causal risk factor for certain kinds of risky behaviors, it is, you know, important to keep in mind it is one risk factor. It's more important than some other risk factors for a given behavior, less important than others. But it's one that is real, is important, and is pointed out because kids, and it isn't just kids, it's adults as well, spend so much time on electronic media these days. It's one that we really do need to think about. What I want to talk about just real quickly today here is this set of risk factors or risk behaviors that lead to problems of like obesity, alcohol use, tobacco use, sexual activity, and violence. Now, I'm going to focus more on the violence issue in part because that's where my expertise really lies, but also because it has more research on it than any of these other areas. In terms of what electronic media effects are. So What we've done in our particular chapter, and what other people in other say articles in this book have done, basically, is to review the research literature and try to come up with a clean answer to the question of whether there are links between electronic media use and specific bad outcomes, and we try to classify those links, that research, as either being strong and causal, or in some cases clearly associated, but not necessarily or not clearly causal. We don't know for sure. There's not enough research to say for sure whether the link is causal or just merely a coincidence. In some cases, the research is suggestive, but it's not even, it's too early to even say that they're clearly associated. And of course, it's possible that electronic media in some cases would be clearly unrelated to certain kinds of risk behaviors. How is this relevant to school administrators, teachers, public policy people, sort of public in general? Well, there are a lot of ways. One is, although most electronic media consumptions, typo there, takes place outside of school, its risks are relevant. Students bring their media influence problem behaviors to the schools. And also the increase in use of electronic media in the schools increases the potential for exposure to damaging content in the school itself. So if you've got internet connections, I can guarantee you students are at least occasionally finding inappropriate things that are likely to be damaging to them. In fact, they tend to be attracted to things that are likely to be damaging. The third reason why I think it's relevant is that schools may be able to educate parents and students about the risks. And just as a real quick footnote, most media literacy programs that are promoted out there actually fail to achieve any kind of effective behavior change. And so, if your school is involved in some of these or are thinking about doing some of these media literacy programs, you need to be very careful to try to find out whether there's any valid research on that program to show that it actually has the kind of, or produces the kind of changes that you're looking for, because most of them don't. Again, I'm going to focus maybe primarily on the media violence example. We know that there are a number of risk factors for youth violence. Typically, you'll see a dozen or so summarized in various textbooks. One of the biggies, of course, is prior aggression level. So kids who are highly aggressive as first graders are much more likely to be highly aggressive as second graders, third graders, junior high students, and so on. We know that growing up in an impoverished environment, growing up in violent neighborhoods is a risk factor. Having antisocial parents is a risk factor. Low IQ is a risk factor for later violence. And of course, we know that media violence is a risk factor. Let me back up a second here. It is also the case that extreme violence, school shootings, for example, usually requires multiple risk factors. In fact, every school shooting that I've been able to get any details about at all typically involves a bunch of risk factors. Any kind of extreme behavior almost always involves, and as far as I can tell, always involves multiple risk factors. So you can't say, yep, Columbine was caused by playing Doom, or was caused by poor parenting, or it was caused in some sense by a convergence of a large number of risk factors. But it's also the case that less extreme violence requires fewer risk factors to be present. And I personally find media violence to be a particularly interesting topic from a public policy and a sort of parenting standpoint, because first of all, a huge proportion of the population is exposed. Second of all, these effects we know accumulate over time and overexposure. And we also know that at some level, at least compared to many of the other risk factors, media violence exposure is relatively easy and inexpensive for parents to do something about. You can't do much about genetics. You can't do much about living in a poor neighborhood or a violent neighborhood. I mean, if you're living in an impoverished environment, there's usually a reason for it, and it's not something you can easily change. But if you have the knowledge about what the risk factors are about media violence, you can at least do something about that one. All right. And based on a review of the literature, it's very clear that media violence is a strong and causal risk factor for later aggressive and violent behavior within school systems as well as outside of the schools. I'm going to show you a little bit of data here. I don't want to go too long. Okay. This is data we recently gathered from high school students. The outcome variable here is the percent of students who report having committed 8 or more violent acts in the prior year. And what I'm going to first of all show you is we've broken down the sample in multiple ways. These are students who have low exposure to violent video games. They very rarely play violent video games. But some of them have no other risk factors. Some of them have some of the, one of these other known risk factors and so on. And what this sort of illustrates is that, yeah, the kids who have more risk factors, in fact, are much more likely to commit violence. And this is true for low exposure video game playing. Those who play a lot of violent video games, if they have no other risk factors, there's not really any difference between these two groups in terms of how likely they are to be high violent students, in terms of high frequency violence. But as soon as you start adding other risk factors, what you see is the violent video game effect starts to become important. Right? And again, this is for a fairly extreme, for high school age, this is a fairly extreme outcome variable. If you look at a less extreme version of an outcome variable, you get kind of the same thing, but there's one interesting difference, and that is when you're looking at more moderate levels of in this case, physical aggression, we wouldn't necessarily call these violent behaviors, but still involve some fighting and pushing and those kinds of things. Okay. What we see in this case is that the effect, in this case of media violence, of violent video games, is pretty much the same regardless of how many other risk factors are present. Okay? All right. Ooh, we're losing something. Come back here. Okay. This is a study done with children, conducted over a course of a school year, roughly 6 months apart. Kids were measured at the beginning of the school year, measured at the end of the school year. And we're looking at outcome variables, the probability of being in a physical fight during that intervening period of time, and as a function of what we would call the risk at the beginning of the school year. So low-risk kids are those who have never previously been in a physical fight and who have a certain constellation of attitudes and values, and there's some parental involvement measures. I'm not going to go into great detail here. And we're also breaking it down by gender. Okay, so girls who are at low risk on a whole bunch of factors and who don't or play a lot of violent video games, roughly 18% of them will be involved in some kind of physical fight during the school year. Girls who who are high risk on some of these other factors, but still are not playing a lot of violent video games, roughly 47%. I mean, so the same thing sort of happens for boys, although you might note that low-risk boys are more likely to be in fights than low-risk girls, and the same thing's true high-risk boys versus high-risk girls, which is sort of another way of saying is that being a boy is a risk factor for being in physical fights. Okay? Boys will be boys. Some of my colleagues in the aggression domain like to talk about testosterone poisoning, and I think, well, that there is an element to that, but there are also other things that, it turns out boys, if you look at the physiological literature, who for one reason or another, sometimes environmental reasons, don't have high enough levels of testosterone, that produces some other really not good long-term effects. So I prefer not to use a testosterone poisoning thing, but you look at figures like this and you say, okay, there is an element there. If they play a lot of violent video games, again, focusing on the violent media, the bars are always bigger. Okay? And again, and this is, again, even after you control for whether or not they were likely to be in fights early on, how aggressive are they naturally, and so on. Now I want to show you a fairly recent video game called Manhunt 2 that can be played on the Wii, where you have this controller that you hold in your hands and you do things. And you can learn how to bowl and you can do all sorts of nice things with the Wii, but you can also learn how to kill with the Wii.
Use the shadows then.
So these are the actions that the player is controlling.
Put some muscle into it. It's for your own good, Danny. They're mine for yours, Danny. It's simple.
Okay. And kids have these. Kids are not supposed to have easy access to these, but kids have these, and in many cases, parents are buying these kind of games for their kids. In fact, the majority of kids, you've heard of Grand Theft Auto series, right? And there's a new one just came out. It turns out that as of like 2 years ago, a majority of kids in, say, 12-year-olds, both boys and girls, have played Grand Theft Auto, even though it's supposed to be restricted to 17-year-olds and above. I also want to show you, now here's a military game. Let's just take a quick look at that. It's a little hard. It loses something in the translation between the screens, but one of the reasons I wanted to show you these things is the quality of the graphics in the modern games is almost the same as film quality, and film quality will be achieved probably within 5 years, so that you can really get the sense of the blood and the gore and that's available. Now, in case you think it's just the extremely bloody, violent sort of things that might be risky to have kids play, here's a children's game explicitly marketed to children. We've shown in some recent research that, in fact, a children's game, this is basically a shooter game. It's no different from other shooter games that are, except that it has happy music, has cute characters, right, and there's no real blood and gore. But the theme is essentially the same, and this gets back to this issue that the content really does matter. And we've shown that college students and elementary students who play this game behave more aggressively afterwards than people who play a neutral, nonviolent game. And increase was roughly 45% in terms of the number of highly aggressive acts that took place after playing this game. So it isn't just the really bloody, gory ones, but even kids' games. If you want to know how big are the video game effects, there are a couple ways of looking at it. One way is to look at other effects that from other domains, and you don't really have to be a statistician to understand this, that basically zero effect means exactly that the risk factor, in this case, what's the effect of, say, taking a daily aspirin on the likelihood of a fatal heart attack, asbestos effects on certain kinds of cancer, and so on. The bigger the bar, the bigger the effect is. And you know, I'm not saying one shouldn't be taking a daily aspirin after a certain age. Some of us do that anyway, or that one should not be taking calcium supplements. You know, these are real effects. But how do these effect sizes compare to violent video game effects? Okay, so you know, people, especially the industry, will try to tell you, oh, the effects are trivial or non-existent. They're lying to you. It's not true. The effects aren't trivial in size, and they do exist. Another way is to look at known risk factors for youth violence, as defined by the Surgeon General's offices, which is where most of these data come from. Substance use at an early age does increase the likelihood of later violent behavior in later adolescence, but that's not a very big effect size. Gang membership is basically, you know, the biggest risk factor, and this is where other risk factors fall into play. You see, being male is kind of up there. Again, this is for fairly extreme youth violence, okay? But having abusive parents really isn't that big of a risk factor in some sense, although it is certainly an important one. Well, research on television violence puts it right smack in the middle. And while we don't have quite comparable evidence on video game violence yet, what evidence we have suggests a pretty sizable effect. Now, I should point out this bar is bigger than what it probably really should be. This particular bar comes from a study that measured a less severe form of aggression. So it's almost certainly the case that if it used the same definition of violence that all these other bars are based on, this green bar probably should be a little bit smaller. But we do know from several studies that in those studies that have both measures of television violence and video game violence, the video game violence effect tends to be larger than the television violence effect. So in some sense, the true green bar, the true video, it should be somewhere bigger than the blue bar and certainly smaller than gang membership. All right. So again, I just wanted to sort of illustrate. I mean, these are the kinds of things that one looks at in trying to decide, you know, is there an effect of electronic media on some risky behavior? In terms of obesity, and again, I'm just going to run through these really quickly, the research does strongly suggest a positive association, right, between amount of time using electronic media, especially TV and movies, and obesity. But the evidence hasn't reached the causal level yet. And partly that's because there haven't been enough high-quality studies of different kinds to tease that apart. My guess is it is a causal relationship, but it looks like it's much more complicated than what people originally thought, and the evidence just isn't there yet. We do know that food advertisements causally influence children's preferences. We also know that most ads that are aimed at children are for unhealthy foods. But we also know that, you know, better research is needed, which takes into account the content of TV shows and movies and interactive media and so on. That might give us a clearer picture of what's going on in the obesity domain. In terms of smoking, the research is much clearer there. We know that exposure to tobacco use in the media does in fact increase the likelihood of certain kinds of smoking-related outcomes. Increases sort of positive attitudes towards viewing smoking, increases the likelihood of a child or adolescent becoming a smoker. We also know, of course, there's a lot of product placement in TV shows and films, but there's almost no research on the internet or video games in terms of smoking kinds of issues. Alcohol research strongly suggests a positive and causal association here as well. And some of the conclusions that I'm drawing today are a little bit different than what's in what we wrote, mainly because there's some studies came out in late 2007 and 2008 that strengthened the case for some of these risk factors. One of the outcomes is people become alcohol consumers at a younger age. Again, in terms of advertising effects, product placement, we know that we see a lot of this in television shows and in films. But again, there's almost no research on the internet, on music effects, or on video game effects. Early initiation of sexual activity, there are actually very, very few studies. I was kind of surprised at how few there are. The studies that do exist suggest an association between exposure to sexualized media and early initiation of sexual activity. But there's really insufficient research to establish a causal link. I also wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on other dangers that are starting to pop up in a few isolated places, things that one probably should be concerned about. We're finding in a number of studies, we found it with children, high school students, and college students, associations between amount of time spent using electronic media and school performance. And not surprisingly, high users tend to perform more poorly in school. The causality of that, again, these are things where really there's very little research, but what research is suggestive. There's some indication that high exposure, especially at a very early age, below the age of 3, may actually lead to attention deficit disorders of one kind or another. And we're finding some similar effects actually at the college student level. Executive control problems, which is also related to attention deficit disorder. A new problem that has emerged in the last, say, 10 years is, in this country, is starting to be called video game addiction. In other countries, it's being called internet addiction. In fact, South Korea already has established 40 treatment centers for what they call internet addiction. It's such a problem there that they're already treating it, although we haven't, in this country, actually defined it as a problem. By an addiction, what I mean is that the behavior is interfering in a serious way with other aspects of one's life. School performance, job performance, family kind of issues, and so on. Impulsivity, lack of empathy. I'm just going to kind of list these. These are things that have at least some empirical support, but it's unclear whether those are merely coincidences related to other sorts of things going on in kids' lives, or whether these are real causal kinds of risk factors. Conclusions: electronic media, powerful socialization and education agents, both because of the amount of time and because of the amount of attention that they're able to draw. Kids learn, it's not surprising to you, but to some parent groups that I talk to, that seems surprising. And, content matters. And there's one last clip I wanted to show you. This is a series of different games. These are games that you may be thinking, well, gosh, we don't allow Manhunt 2 on our computers, either in our, in your house or in your school system or whatever. These are games that are easily available on the internet. It takes about 2 or 3 clicks to find such games. Games where you can target particular racial groups, ethnic groups, nationalities. This last game is called Border Crossing, where you get to shoot Mexicans as they cross the Rio Grande. And you get extra points for killing pregnant women as they cross the Rio Grande. So, again, you've got internet connections available. Kids are going to find these kind of games. Some of them are much worse than what I'm showing here. So, again, I don't want to sort of leave you with the idea that I think video games are off. I actually like video games, and my kids, as I say, sort of grew up with video games and electronic media. But there are a lot of dangers, risk factors out there, and we need to do a better job of screening them from kids, in my view. So I will stop there. Thanks.
That was pretty easy. Okay. All right, well, I'm very happy to be here. It promises to be a very, very important and exciting day with a lot of interesting presentations about what technology can do for kids, and I think that's very important. What am I missing here? Pardon me?
Where's it at? Is it on your own?
It's right there. What are you looking for?
Trying to get it up on the screen. Okay.
Was it not up there? No. Thank you. Appreciate that. Actually, as Craig was talking about the research on media violence, I was thinking a little bit about my experiences as an advocate in Washington, and I ran an organization that I co-founded, the Center for Media Education, for 12 years in Washington. And one of the things we did was bring the research from the research community to the policy arena and try to use it to help inform policy. And one of the issues I worked on in the 90s was the very famous V-chip, and some of you have heard this who were at last night's event. But it was very challenging. I ended up spending 30 days at a negotiating table with the head of the Motion Picture Association, Jack Valenti, the head of the National Association of Broadcasters, and the head of the National Cable Television Association. And I represented and shared this negotiation process with 9 other advocacy groups representing the major groups, the National Education Association, the National PTA, the American Medical Association, the 2 APAs. We were there to try to get the television industry to be more responsive to parents and educators and health professionals about the need to include what the term that we use, content descriptors, in the television ratings. And as you may know, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 mandated, and it was really the culmination of this many, many years of research on media violence, many years of debate on the Hill, and lots of industry efforts to try to deny that there was any impact of media violence on kids. And finally, that came to a piece of legislation that required this little V-chip in our television sets. And there were deals made, by the way, in Washington. And I'll just plug my book here. Well, let me just do it like this. I've written about it in a book that came out last year. And I'll go back, and this is the organization that I ran, the Center for Media Education, and there we are on the V-chip, since I've decided to start a little bit with that story. At any rate, the industry was supposed to come up with a rating system, a voluntary rating system. That was the deal, because you can't require it. You can't get the government to impose it because of the First Amendment concerns that Elisabeth raised, a very tricky line that everybody had to walk. But the industry had proposed and come up with a TV rating system based on the movie ratings, an age-based system that designated certain programs for certain age groups. And the educators and parents groups and health groups kept saying, look, that's not going to really help us. What we really want to know, and particularly since we have all this research on TV violence, is which programs have the violence. And I'm telling you, the industry wanted to do all it could to keep from putting any designation about the violent content into their ratings. They created a children's rating called TVY7 for 7 years and older, which really meant that that's the stuff that has violence in it, but don't ask us, we're not going to talk about it. And they just wouldn't do it. And so our coalition decided we are going to push this. We went to Congress to get help. We went to the press. We launched a huge campaign to really kind of force the television industry to sit down to make them more accountable and to get the content descriptors included. And I remember one of the hardest things, we did get them to include, and it is very complicated, these 4 content descriptors, VSLD, and as some of you heard last night, my husband always teases me when a TV show starts and you see that TV 14 DSL, and of course I think only about 10 of us understand what that means. So it certainly did not turn out to be a perfect system. My husband always says to me, well, you always did want to write for television, and so there you have. That was my contribution to television. But the point was that we wanted the industry to be accountable and to admit and say when there was violence in the programming. And one of the things we did was to bring the research to the negotiations, and particularly when it came time to talk about TV for kids. And then we had to show some of the programs because Valenti kept saying, well, what do you mean violence? What's violence? Tom and Jerry? Is it Tom and Jerry? And we say, look, you haven't been watching TV lately. So what we did is we brought a reel of recent shows that were currently on, and one of them was the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And just as your videos, compelling videos can show, he couldn't get around the fact that there was like real violence, real life violence in the programming, and we also talked to him about what the research was. They did ultimately agree to put some kind of designation for violence, and it's a long story, and the negotiations were fascinating and frustrating, and we ended up with FV for fantasy violence, which I argued against. And unfortunately, some people think that means family values or something like that. Very discouraging. But as I always say, one of my most humbling experiences in recent years has been coming to Washington to try to effect some changes in policy. It's a fascinating experience, but it's also very challenging. I am not a media effects researcher, so I'm a little different here in terms of the panel. I bring a variety of different perspectives, different experiences. I have been studying the development of the new digital media culture and its relationship with children for about 15 years. And that's what I've written about in my new book, which I just showed before. As I said, I ran a policy group for 12 years. I continue to do some work in the policy arena, working on issues having to do with marketing and privacy, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I'm also very happy with the law that we got passed in 1998, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It often gets confused with the Child what is it called? I even get it mixed up with COPA, with the Child Online Protection Act. I just saw it in an industry trade, and they should have known better. And it's partly because the two laws were linked in the legislative vehicle. But the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which was the culmination of a several-year campaign that my organization conducted in Washington and negotiations that we did with the Federal Trade Commission and with the industry, was really designed to get some kinds of rules of the game in place in terms of marketing to children, and particularly around data collection. And what it did do is it curtailed some of what was going to be a very highly commercialized and privacy, how do I say, a set of practices that were designed to collect a lot of personal information from young children. And this applies to children under the age of 13. So, but the idea there was that it was in the early fluid days of this commercial online culture. And I could see where it was all going. I went to a trade meeting in New York in 1990, when was it? 94, I think it was. And marketers were up there talking about all the great things they were going to be able to do online with kids, and they would have product spokes characters developing ongoing personal relationships with kids. They were showing research that when kids went online, they went into the flow state, which was a perfect state for marketing and advertising, and I could see at the outset, I can all see it all coming to life and what was going to be happening, and decided that we needed to do something to at least get a public debate going on about that, and we've tried to continue to do that and to do some intervention, and we were able to do that, not to stop the commercialization of the culture, certainly not to do that, but to enable us to do some interventions. I'm also an educator. I've gone back to teaching in 2003, which has really afforded me a good opportunity to learn from my students as well as to try to teach them something, and then I'm also a parent. I actually came to parenthood pretty late in life, at the age of mid-40s, and my daughter was born, she's really a digital generation child. She was born almost to the day of the launch of the World Wide Web, which is very interesting. And in the acknowledgments of my book, I thank her, my digital generation child. And when she read that, she looked at me and she said, "Mom, you used me." And I suppose I did, and I've tended to, in my sort of informal research process, whenever she's with her friends, I will say, "Oh, hey, excuse me, can I ask you a question?" I'm sure you do this too, right? What do you do when you're online? She says, "Don't answer that." She's trying to get information out of you. Don't tell her anything about it. But you do learn a lot from observing and being a parent, and you also realize the frustrations of parenthood. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social networks. I'm going to talk about some trends and some of the research. There is not a whole lot. But I first want to share with you some of the key themes that I think are important to understand when we think about this new digital media culture, and particularly some of the differences that we see between it and traditional media. And I think one of the first and most important things is just to realize that media culture is changing. Yes, it's true, kids are still watching television, but we've seen a whole array of new interactive technologies that are becoming part of their everyday lives. They're integrated into their social structure. They're also integrated into our political discourse, our democratic processes. And digital media are here to stay. They're changing very rapidly. And in the modern vernacular, we just have to deal with it. We might want to return to simpler times, but we can't do that, so we need to deal with it. And I think young people are what I would call defining users. We know they're early adopters. They take to new media, not every single one of them, but many of them take to new media very comfortably, very easily. And as this is actually a quote from a market researcher who said, they're not just adopting the internet, they're internalizing it. And they're also internalizing a set of expectations and behaviors that sort of become part of how they're wired. At least that's how it is looking to me from my perspective. And many young people now are living their lives online. And I think one of the really interesting things about it, and particularly I think when we look at adolescence, is how uniquely tailored these new interactive technologies are to the fundamental developmental tasks or needs that they're undertaking as they grow up. And again, I've been able to observe this firsthand in addition to researching it. And one of the key things that adolescents are involved in is identity exploration. You are, as a young person, trying to figure out who you are in the world and how you're going to present yourself in the world. And internet and interactive technologies are perfect for this. Another is self-expression. Obviously, not for the first time, but in very new ways, I think, there are vehicles for young people to find their voices and to be able to express themselves to others. obviously developing relationships with peers. This is a certain period in their life when they're developing their interactions with other people, with friends, romantic liaisons, and as much as it's hard for parents to accept, they're moving away from parents and families and interacting more with their own social circles, and obviously becoming more autonomous. And if you think about mobile technology, for example, and the kinds of freedoms mobile technology affords young people and the way they can interact with others and what they can do on their own, it's really quite amazing, and I think quite unprecedented as well. The other important thing to know is that children and adolescents are a huge, huge market, and that has been taking place. That market has grown over the last 30, 40 years for a variety of reasons. With new technologies, marketers were poised at the outset of the new digital media culture in the early 90s to zoom in and target young people as a very, very lucrative target market. I remember in the early days they referred to them as the lucrative cyber-tot demographic. I like that one. The lucrative cyber-tots. They have been tracking and studying and monitoring and following everything that young people are doing online. And they issue reports. Market researchers issue reports all the time. This is only one of many. A lot of them cost, maybe $1,000. And we've gotten a few in our research, but we don't have a budget that allows us to buy all of them and read all of them, although a lot of the information is online. But the most important thing, and this has been going on for a long time, is that the market research has gone far ahead of and has far outpaced the academic research on new media, on interactive technologies and young people. And we're still all trying to play catch up. My colleagues are trying to play catch up. It's difficult because also technologies are changing so rapidly. But what's happened with the market research infrastructure is that these companies have developed sort of a close symbiotic relationship with young people, involving them in focus groups, communicating with them really on a regular basis. I don't know, how many of you have heard of this? Tremor? This is a company that was created by Procter & Gamble. And it is an online focus group, essentially, that also identifies the influencers among teenagers, who are the ones with the biggest social networks of friends, the ones who like to talk about brands, and there's all kinds of research on who likes to talk about brands, who is going to be sharing information with a lot of people. And then these people are made privy to the latest product developments. They're used to get information from their friends, to share information with their friends. Sometimes they're given upcoming television programs, for example, before they're on the air, so that they're real insiders. And this is, again, just one example of the huge amount of tracking and monitoring of young people that goes on within the digital marketplace and continues to go on. Now, let me talk a little bit now about social networks, and I'm just going to go over a few of the research findings to date and some of the trends, and just highlight them. And there's actually a very good article by Patricia Greenfield and Kaveri, and I know her by Kaveri. I can't remember the last. Can't pronounce it. How do you pronounce it? Superhamim, yeah, at UCLA, who, by the way, are part of a digital children's digital network initiative that I'm happy to say I helped get the funding for about 10 years ago. And they are doing some very interesting research, and I would recommend that article. It's really, really, I think, very useful. It's very readable and very accessible. I think social networks are in many ways the perfect tool for adapting to and tapping into these developmental needs and tasks. And that, I think, explains why they've become so popular so quickly for young people. And I will go very quickly. I'm not going to go through the statistics, but this is just an example. I mean, this came in my email the other day from Harris Interactive of some of the recent trends with social networks. And I think it's interesting to look at how young some of the kids are who are attracted to them and how popular social networks are. The other interesting thing is what a useful tool they are for identity formation and identity exploration. And as one researcher, Dana Boyd, writes, they are writing themselves into being. In many ways, I think the profiles are akin to the teenage bedroom. There's really a fascinating literature on teen bedroom culture. Very, very interesting reading. My colleague Jane Brown at University of North Carolina has done some of that work, where researchers actually study what teens put up in their rooms to express who they are and to explore their identities. I mean, we've all witnessed this if we've had a teenager. But the fact that it's actually studied, the interesting thing, just as a side point, is that the market researchers are studying that too. I was invited a few years ago to a conference at Yahoo, where they actually had taken the bedrooms of teenagers from nearby neighborhoods and brought them to the Yahoo headquarters, the bedrooms and the teenagers. So you had the walls, you had the furniture, you had the media, and you had the teenagers sitting on the bed, sometimes with the boyfriend, and then the market researchers could walk through and actually talk to them about what they do. Fascinating. But social networks, I think, are the kind of virtual equivalent to a teenager's bedroom. And I think that makes them particularly compelling and inviting spaces for young people. And obviously, they are a perfect place to explore relationships. And researchers are trying to figure out, what does this mean in terms of friendship? Is it altering the nature of friendship? I mean, you don't have 5 friends anymore, or 10 friends, or 20 friends. You have 500 friends. And what does that mean? What is a friend anymore? And some researchers have found, for example, that kids don't want to offend the friends who want to link to them, so they just kind of accept more and more friends. Well, what is that going to mean in the future? And I don't think we know that yet. Again, we're still trying to sort of figure out some of that stuff. But it's also what's interesting about it is that there is a kind of constant connectivity that we see with the new digital media, and that is you can be connected to your friends whenever you want, wherever you want, and it's just kind of built into and wired into their systems now. And I mentioned last night that I was talking to my daughter the other day, well, what if we moved away? Wouldn't that be hard? Because usually for high school kids it would be. We were having a kind of hypothetical conversation. She said, well, not really, because I'd still be connected to all my friends all the time in the same way that I am, through text messaging. And the way that text messaging is being used on the way that this communication is being used in social networks and elsewhere is very interesting, and researchers are studying some of that. And Pew did a study, Pew Internet and American Life, a couple of years ago, showing that kids use text messaging to do some of the difficult things in terms of communication that you don't want to do face-to-face. So if you want to ask somebody out, you do it with instant messaging. You don't want to go out with them anymore, you do it with instant messaging. That's pretty tacky, I think. But I actually asked students recently, do any of you use it for these purposes? And a few hands went up, and then one student came up to me afterward and she said, gee, Professor, do you think we're going to be all right? Which I thought was really interesting, because they're worried, I think, about what all this means. Obviously, the blurring of the public and the private, and then there's some interesting gender differences, for example, that we're learning that girls tend to use social networks to enhance their pre-existing relationships, although they will add friends, whereas boys want to use them to flirt and develop new relationships. Parents and family, I'll be real quick on this one, although I think this is a critical issue for people. There are few studies about parental concerns about social networks. One found that 1 in 3 parents thought that the time teens spent on MySpace took away time from family rituals, such as meals. As my mother would say, I could have told you that. You didn't need a $500,000 grant. That's one of her great lines. But then other researchers have argued that social networks are really in many ways the only public space. And if you think of them as a public space, as the new kind of civic space, as one researcher says, the only public space where teens can hang out in an otherwise highly structured and regulated family, educational, and social environment. And I think that's kind of interesting, that this is sort of their new street corner, in a way, in our modern day. Quickly, just the issue of stranger danger, and I'm just using the alliterative phrase that the Brits use. There are concerns about encountering strangers online. Not a whole lot of research about this to support widespread concern, although some conflicting research between U.S. studies and European studies, for example. The industry is very interested in reducing the risks associated with social networks and strangers, and MySpace, after the News Corp audit, hired a safety czar. More recently, the Harvard Berkman Center has formed an internet safety task force with industry, so obviously it's a great concern. And there's a lot of press, obviously, around other risks online, and this one I think everybody is familiar with, about the young girl who committed suicide after a hoax was played on her by the parents of another friend. So I think the takeaway point on this, and Nancy will probably talk about it and did talk about it last night, is that kids who are at risk to begin with are going to be at risk, and in some cases more at risk in these social spaces, and that's something people have to deal with in these new online social spaces. There are privacy controls in response to some of the concerns that the companies have set up, and again, research on this is conflicting. One study showed that 44% of kids used these controls, another said that the majority did not, and that the default was for open access. Let's see quickly. Try to move forward here. I do want to make one point here, and I think it often gets overlooked, and that is the civic engagement potential of social networks and all digital media. There is an enormous capacity here and an enormous amount of opening for young people to be engaged in politics, in political activism, in community involvement, in all kinds of wonderful ways, and a lot of them are doing it. And there are many, many examples. And these social networks are important vehicles for that kind of expression, and that's also an important part of young people's development that we need to pay attention to. Quickly, I'll mention a study I did a couple of years ago. This is available online, called Youth as E-Citizens, where we did a mapping of the youth civic landscape online, finding hundreds and hundreds of very, very interesting sites, including, and this is the youth vote that I'll show. This is the other thing, youth vote, lots of youth vote initiatives using the internet to promote youth involvement. We've seen a rise in youth voting in the last couple of elections. We hope to again. To what extent the internet is playing a role, we don't know, but I think it can be an important factor. This group, I understand, is going to speak later today, Global Kids. Terrific group, wonderful work, another kind of social network in a nonprofit context, which I think we also have to look at. There are lots of ways nonprofits can use these tools. And then finally, and I don't have time to show this video, but I do want to mention that because of the nature of marketing in the new digital media environment and because of the nature of social networks, they are a prime target for behavioral targeting. Marketers refer to them as viral marketing on steroids. The targeting we can do is just phenomenal. If you think about everything, even if you set the privacy controls, they're not privacy controls that are kept away from marketers. For marketers, everything you put up on that site is fair game. So your sexual orientation, your diseases, if you have diseases you're concerned about, sexual issues, political beliefs, whether you smoke or drink. Think of all the stuff kids put up on their websites. This is part of an elaborate profile that marketers are collecting, and they're able to follow people, not just kids, all of us, as we traverse the web and elsewhere to use these profiles for behavioral targeting. And it's a huge area, not a lot is known about it outside of small circles in Washington and in New York and in Silicon Valley, of course. But I think it will become an increasingly important issue people will need to know about. There are some interventions I'll mention. I'll just whip by this. This was the beacon brouhaha, as I call it, over some of their new marketing techniques that they developed at Christmas, unfortunately for them, and there was a backlash. But the FTC held a workshop in November on behavioral targeting and has been engaged in a proceeding with consumer groups. I've been part of this, privacy organizations, et cetera, and child advocacy groups. We just filed comments on a set of proposed principles by the FTC on online targeting and privacy protection. So we're in conversations with industry as well. I'll just leave that there. But the other thing to know is it's all moving very quickly. So the social networks that are online are also on digital platforms, along with the marketing, by the way. And there are new companies coming along to take advantage of this as well. Do I have a minute to show this little character? If I can make him talk. Let's see if I can make this little guy talk. This is a new virtual personality application that will be used for viral marketing on mobile and other platforms. Let me just read the copy from the marketers. Engage your mobile audience or create a highly personalized user experience on your corporate website. Users create their own animated messages that can be sent over email or directly to wireless devices. Message recipients receive a highly personalized branded message which links them back to your site or offering, all in an immersive branded experience. And that's a phrase that you hear all over the place. Let's see if we can get this little character.
Hi, I'm Lucky. You can send me as a greeting to say silly things, have fun, or just say hi. Send me as a greeting or message to someone's email or mobile phone. I'm sure to brighten your day. Look, I can shake my head, nod, and even wink. Any way you look at it, it's great being the beeper to deliver messages of love, appreciation, or good old-fashioned fun. And I promise I won't ever chew your slippers or pee on the carpet. See you soon.
All right, talk to you soon. And whatever brand you're representing. Anyway, a little vision of the future. I just want to draw your attention to two resources that I've been part of that I think are very helpful ways of understanding what's going on with digital media. I have materials I left outside about this study that I did with another co-author last year, 1 year ago, on interactive food and beverage marketing connected with the childhood obesity issue. And in fact, there's been almost no research on interactive marketing. And most of the research on food marketing and kids is about television, but the train has moved out of the station. A lot of it's going on in these interactive technologies. This is kind of a primer of how all of interactive marketing works in what's called the digital marketing ecosystem. And the full report's 98 pages. It's at digitalads.org. But as I said, the executive summary we have outside. And then I'm also part of this project that the MacArthur Foundation is funding. This is a terrific resource. It is an initiative on digital media and learning. I'm sure, how many of you already know about this? It's a great resource. And the authors were part of a 6-volume series on a whole lot of different issues. I was in the Civic Life Online volume. There was one on identity. There's one on gaming. And I forget what the other 3 are about, but they're very accessible, very interesting, and they're all available online, published by MIT Press, which is also my publisher. So if you go to MIT Press and look up digital media and learning, or go to MacArthur, look up digital media and learning, really, really useful resources. I highly recommend them. And then finally, I would just say that social networks, like all of digital media, are part of the fabric of our children's lives. And we can't really and should not try to shut them off from their media culture. But I think we need to understand it. I think we do need to incorporate it into what and how we teach. We need to help young people learn to be responsible and make the right decisions in these new spaces that are part of their social lives. And we need to create policies that will harness these tools in ways that will benefit them. And then finally, I think we need to reframe the public debate so that we're not just talking about protecting young people from harmful content, that we're really not just looking at them in that way, but really figuring out and using new kinds of research also to figure out how to take advantage of the potential here of these interactive technologies and to think of young people as active contributors to our culture and participants in our democracy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. This was fascinating and richly informative. I'm mindful that this is supposed to be break time, but I'm going to consult with Lisa to see what she feels. 5 minutes for questions? Okay, and then we will break for 10 minutes. Okay. Is there anyone with a burning question? I know that the panelists would be willing to stay for a little while to talk with people who might have questions beyond that, but is there anyone who would like to pose a question? Yes.
Question for Dr. Anderson. I actually received an email message last night from a reporter asking me about kids creating violent videos, or kids who are creating videos of themselves. And here's what I responded, and I'd really like to know what you think of this issue. I said, we know from decades of research that excessive exposure to violent media leads to positive beliefs about violence, engagement in violent acts, and lack of sensitivity to victims. It's highly probable that excessive exposure to media violence, combined with the availability of low-cost video production technologies, is now also leading to the creation of violent media by children.
Yes, one of the things that's just recently in the news. Yeah, a number of you probably have seen in the recent news some of the issues involved in posting violent videos that kids make of beating up each other on YouTube. That's sort of a new one. I mean, obviously there's no research on it at this point in time, but I'm sure that our violence-laden culture, including all the media violence, has contributed to creating people who are able to do that. Along the same lines, there was a thing on CNN headline news last night about the new Grand Theft Auto game, and one of the people talking about that on there pointed out that historically it's been very difficult to get the American soldier to actually shoot at an enemy the first time they're in combat. The estimates from World War II was that something like only 15%, even when an enemy's sort of shooting at them, only about 15% could actually bring themselves to shoot back at someone. And over the years, the military, of course, has been very, very concerned about that, and that is, if you agree that you should have a military, then you should probably agree that they should be effective, at least in that context. And different training techniques, as they went from bullseye targets to human silhouettes, and of course now the military is using video games as part of their training. And I think it was by Vietnam, the initial shooting rate was closer to 50 or 75%, and now it's almost 100%. Which from a military standpoint is okay, but you have to wonder, are we also doing this to, and this has always been my concern, are we doing this to kids in adolescence, and is that what's showing up on YouTube? That this generation is now so desensitized to violence and it's been so glamorized that they're willing to create videos and then of them beating up on someone and then post it so that others can see how violent they are. That's rather sick and scary.
Thank you. Yes?
One quick question. What do we know, if anything, about this whole issue in the United States versus other countries in the world? You talked a little bit about South Korea and some of the issues there. This issue of violence, we are a very violent country. As compared to other countries, how are their children exposure to computers and violence and TV compared with others?
Most modern, industrialized countries have legal restrictions on access to the most violent video games and movies and so on. In fact, Great Britain, although Great Britain keeps going back and forth over the years, sort of depending on who's in power and all of that, but they recently have proposed in Parliament to require cigarette-style warning labels, which actually is something that my colleagues and I proposed in a book that was published a little over a year ago, that would be one public policy option. And warning labels says, warning, this game contains violent content. Violent content has been shown to increase the likelihood of aggressive. So most really do restrict. Some countries absolutely just flat out ban certain games. A lot of countries do. But even those countries ignore, for the most part, the fact that cartoon violence also creates pretty much the same effects. So that there are myths out there about how, well, if it's cartoonish and cute and happy, it can't have any harmful effects. Well, that's a myth. It's not true.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the previous question, I think, of the kids constructing games. We run after-school programs where kids learn by constructing video games. They don't construct violent games, okay? So I don't know if they think, well, I'm in school, so I'm not supposed to do that, but that's not their natural tendency. I think if they're coming off a thing where they're modding a violent game is the way they're creating the new one, but they're creating it from scratch. In fact, what we use is a program called Scratch from the IT Media Lab. Then it hasn't been my experience that they tend to do that. In fact, in New York City, there's this whole charter school built around the whole curriculum around constructing video games. And they're not constructing violent games either. So it doesn't have to be violent games that kids construct at all.
Yeah, I just want to say around this whole issue, and I was interviewed actually about the beating up thing on YouTube as well. I am disturbed by the role that the news media play in all of this too. These are isolated incidents. I'm not saying that they're not happening, and I think there's a lot of stuff going on that's very disturbing, but they do tend to hype and probably to promote more interest in this kind of thing among young people. And I think it's a real issue. And even as somebody who sometimes ends up participating because I get interviewed, it's something that I think we need to talk about. How do we present the information to the world, to the public about this new media, and what role do our news media play? What are their responsibilities?
Okay, I think that our time is up. Please join me in thanking our four panelists.
Thank you.